Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. Today, I have two longtime friends, Dr. David Rosch, Dr. Dan Jenkins, and we have tri-edited a book. I don't know what that's called. We'll think of something cool to call that. I'm very excited about this. It's called Moving the Needle: What We Know and Don't Know About Leader Development, or it's called something like that. We'll put the official name in the show notes. Do either of you remember the actual name?
Yeah, Moving the Needle: What We Know and Don't Know About Developing Leaders.
Okay, so I was close. Thank you, Dave. Dave, I started this podcast with you, and that was over 5 years ago, and you were episode number 1. Awesome. And that episode was called I Have a Fear. And we had this really fun conversation, and I'll let you give a little bit of color to it. But let's start there today. We're going to focus on the book that we've written. We're going to focus on what we're trying to accomplish with that book. But let's start there with the I Have a Fear conversation and go forward. Is that cool?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it was 5 years ago, and there was a lot of fear in the world. I remember recording that episode in my basement, being quarantined for COVID at that point in time. And the specific fear that I remember us talking about, Scott, was about the impact of all of the billions of dollars that we're spending on leader development programs in education and business. And the fear was that money may be doing nothing other than helping people label themselves as leaders, not developing their skills, not increasing their capacity, not recognizing their gaps, but simply stamping themselves as someone who then is a leader. We do that in higher ed. We do that in business training programs. And it's a fear because we put a lot of resources into it. We don't know a lot. We don't have a lot of empirical evidence about the impact of those programs.
So talk a little bit about the book. And you and I were this might have been 2022 when we first started talking about this a little bit. But talk a little bit about the impetus of this book.
The book itself, the subtitle, What We Know and Don't Know About Developing Leaders, it was designed to help respond to that fear. And it's 34 chapters, each chapter focused on a different instructional strategy designed to develop leaders and develop leaders in all the different areas where leadership development might be occurring in schools, in colleges and universities, in business organizations, in the civic arena, in all of the different ways that people can spend time, effort, and energy in developing people into better leaders. And each chapter looks at, what do we know? How do we know this works, this particular strategy? And then what don't we know? What are we just presuming, which then leads to what could we do to fill that gap? How can we fill the hole, the deficit in our knowledge, so that maybe 5 years from now, we can eliminate what we don't know. The second edition of the book might be what we really now know about developing leaders after a generation of scholarship and research has been put to bear.
Okay, so Dan Jenkins, thank you so much for being with us. And why don't you talk a little bit about instructional strategies? We have 34 chapters. We have instructional strategies. Would you define instructional strategies for listeners so everyone's on the same page?
Anything that has to do with pedagogy, andragogy, instructional assessment strategies is what I geek out on, what I love. When we're talking about instructional strategies, we're talking about that vehicle, that conduit through which we facilitate learning, or in this case, leadership learning. And so one of the things that I loved about this idea when you and Dave approached me with it, and I think you knew you had your ace in the hand anyway, when it was going to be about pedagogy, because my dissertation research was all on what are the most frequently used strategies that we use in instruction, which later turned into some more research around assessment strategies and learning goals and online, face-to-face, synchronous learning, asynchronous learning, hybrid spaces. And how do we do this work when we're in the leadership classroom and we're thinking about higher ed context, but also more broadly in our training and development spaces that might be adjacent to or outside of higher education. But this project, as well as a project that Dr. Kathy Guthrie and I co-authored, a book called The Role of Leadership Educators, Transforming Learning, where we spent about half of that book looking at different pedagogical strategies as well, and putting them within the lens of higher education, student development, and what have you, was this idea of how do we continue to develop that capacity around what we know and what we don't. And this idea of leadership educators, folks that work in education, training, development spaces, what do they actually know about the ins and outs of these different approaches? It brings me back to when I was doing a pilot study for what became my dissertation research, and I was meeting with someone in my program that I taught with in the leadership minor at University of South Florida. And I said, hey, when you think about your teaching, what's the instructional strategy that you would say you go to most? What do you tend to lean on? And her response was, Dale, what kind of instructional strategies are there? I don't have names for these things. And I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. Like, how do we move that needle? And so part of when I put forth in the early parts of my career was, how do I help the folks in my own community of practice to move that needle and develop their capacity a little bit more, so that we have a shared language around these different tools and strategies and approaches that we might use to do the thing that we're trying to do anyway.
Yeah. And so I think you hit the nail on the head here. And so we might be using a 360 assessment. We might be using case and point methodology. We might be using action learning or action research or lecture methodology or small group discussions. But what do we actually know about how they are used in leadership learning, with the effectiveness? And Dave, I'd love to go back to you now. What do we know? What do we don't know? What are some observations you have?
Yeah, I'll start with this. I remember sitting in a session being given by Dr. Becky Reichert at Claremont Graduate College, and she was talking about a study that her research team had done looking at 50 years of leadership research. And the main point that she was talking about, and she got increasingly cynical in the way she was making this point, is that we have 50 years of research that says that leadership matters, which is great. Leadership matters. We know leadership matters. And she got to the point where she was saying, can we stop doing research about whether leadership matters? We know that it matters. But what we don't know is how does it matter? And I think that gets at some of the things that we're trying to talk about. We know how influential a great leader to an organization the effects that organizational leader can have on the health, on the progress, on the achievement, on the success of that organization. We don't know how in a lot of different ways. And I think that needs to be something that we focus on, especially in the educational field. I think when we're talking about development, when we're talking about training, when we're talking about capacity building in students, what we don't have a great picture on what are the specific things that people need to do when X happens in an organization to help them then overcome that obstacle, whatever obstacle X is causing. And I think that needs to be a focus of the scholarship of the field of leader development. We know that leaders matter. We know that their development is important. We know that organizations are successful when these leaders have self-reported high skills. We need to do a little bit more to unlock that puzzle of when someone knows how to do X, they can solve Y. And when they can solve Y, organizations can achieve Z. I would love to have a little bit more focus on that.
It's a conversation the three of us have had a number of times about how we scaffold this learning. And what do we know about how we scaffold the learning? That learning has been scaffolded in medical schools. That learning has been scaffolded in pilot training. And at times, I don't know that we're super clear, not only about what needs to be taught when, but how we teach that and what is the best way for us to communicate that information and help internalize that information so that someone has the knowledge, the skills, the experience, as we've talked about before. Dan, what do you think?
Yeah, you're speaking my language again. I think so much about the developmental sequencing conundrum, right? It is one of the holy grails of our field. When I think about, you mentioned pilot training, and I think about math as an analogy all the time. You got to learn algebra before you can learn trig before pre-calc, before calc. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called pre-calc. And then you go into whatever it is that engineers do, right? With parabolas and spaceships and stuff, right? But with leadership, do you learn ethics before you talk about teams and groups? Do you talk about org culture before you talk about public speaking and delegation and empowerment? Like, in what order do we do this in? And there's been a little bit of research. I know Corey Seemiller and Rich Ritney have written about that and developing some of that taxonomy around leadership competencies. And that's one approach, and it's a good approach. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can look at it. And looking at leadership curriculum, whether it be at the undergraduate or graduate level, there's certainly some themes, but I think we're still trying to unpack what is the right order to teach these things. And to kind of the points that I think you were somewhat alluding to, both and Dave, is, okay, if we're trying to get leaders to do X, Y, and Z, where are those skill deficits? Okay, if these are the skill deficits, the knowing, being, doing, whatever you want to call it, what pedagogical interventions are going to facilitate learning in those areas? How do we intentionally select instructional strategies, pedagogies to target particular gains in X, Y, or Z? What's expected? What are the expected learning goals at each stage of a learner's development? What types of learning are appropriate to attain certain things? Not just appropriate for what needle we're trying to move, but what's also developmentally appropriate for learners. When I'm working with undergrads, it's a lot different than if I'm doing consulting with an engineering firm, right? Different types of pedagogies, or what some folks would say, don't use the pedagogy word, use the andragogy word, right? These are adults, but we also know that adults sometimes learn a lot better like kids, or that there are ways to facilitate learning that work well with kids that also work really well with adults. We just know that adults have a lot more lived experiences of which to incorporate in and to facilitate as part of the learning process than 5 and 6 year olds.
And outside of academia, no one knows what andragogy or pedagogy really means.
That's right. And it's an ongoing, although the way that I describe it, this is the best way I can describe that. And it goes to the lived experiences, analogy or example. Right before we left Florida, I took my daughter, I think she was 5 at the time, my oldest daughter, on a field trip with her class, with her preschool, to a state park. And there's 50 preschoolers, and they're about to go on a nature walk. And the park ranger is trying to talk about what's going on and wants to get there, get everyone's attention, and says something about the types of animals that they might see on the nature walk. And says, does anybody have any questions? And she had just talked about some of these animals that we might see on the nature walk. 50 preschoolers' hands go up. And she says, no stories, only questions. And 50 hands went down. Because that's where they're at. It's like, this one time I saw an alligator, and that's not what we're looking at, right? We're trying to build a different type of capacity with adults than we are with preschoolers.
Well, and Dave, I think one thing, at least for me, that I took away is that there's a lot of opportunity. As we went chapter to chapter, and again, for listeners, it's 34 chapters of interventions. We're calling them instructional strategies, but assessments, something like the MBTI or the DISC. What do we actually know? What impact is this having? And so any number of these different interventions that we can use to teach once the scaffolding is making sense. What do you think? What'd you walk away? What was your impression as you look across the 34 chapters? I know research is your jam. And what'd you see?
Yeah, some of these strategies have been around for a long time. The Myers-Briggs, for example, has been around for a long time. Some of these strategies have only really begun to emerge over the past decade or two, even more recently than that. We had a chapter on artificial intelligence, for example, and how to use generative chat-based AI as a tool for leader development. But still, the typical frame of the chapter of all the chapters is, what do we know about why this thing works? And then what don't we know? What should we know? What do we need to know about its effectiveness to be more intentional about its application? And themes that shot up around most of the chapters is the research that has been brought to bear about the typical instructional strategy is researcher X studied a small population of people that were recipients of the instructional strategy. They said that it worked really well for them. It satisfied their need for what they wanted to learn. Researcher Y went into an organization and looked at the people that had received this strategy, and many of them did not get fired. So we're calling that a success. And that's what the research said. Now that's positive research, right? Like I wouldn't read that and say, we don't know anything about that strategy. We do know about that strategy. We know that it can be well received if it's given. We know that it meets a lot of people's needs. We know that it gives people a sense of confidence that they could apply leadership capacities in the environments where they're at. That's what the research says. What we don't know yet is what that strategy unlocks. So I spent a day with people learning about my personality from an MBTI perspective. I'm using this as a random example. What does that unlock in me as it relates to my leader development in the context where I'm at? And I think that question sounds really simple. Why have we not done anything like that? That's actually, I think, a pretty deceptively difficult question to answer, because there's not just one Dave. There's 8 billion Daves. And of all the contexts in which leadership and leader development is happening, there's billions of contexts. And how someone leads IBM is different than how someone leads Girl Scouts of America, which is different than how someone is a Little League coach. There are clearly connections, right? There are connections between how someone can be successful in all of those environments, but there are also pretty clear differences. And I think that opportunity is a great key theme emerging from this, is that there are so many opportunities to look at how would understanding my personality help run a Fortune 500 company? How does understanding my personality help as a Little League coach? There are similar, and then the next step is, let's look at how that's similar and how that's different. And then that is how we build our field. And that's, I think, where we have the opportunity to advance in understanding our knowledge about the process of leader development.
Yeah. Dan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think you're talking about context, Dave, a lot, right? And I think brings me to a connection to the International Leadership Association had this global team of folks that 4 or 5 years ago had this task force where they put together these general principles for leadership programs. And one of the sections of that I had opportunity to help with a team of folks from about 4 different countries on that particular section was this idea of how do we fine tune the intentionality around the teaching and learning practices that we choose, and that being driven by what we termed, which we borrowed from D. Fink's work on creating significant learning experiences, what he calls situational factors. We termed it more like contextual factors, right? It's all these questions about what do you know about your learners? And what do you know about yourself as that facilitator of learning? And those questions it's not what's your favorite food, what's your favorite color, it's demographics, how big is your class, how small is your class, where are your learners coming from, what are how big is your program, how small is your program, how big is your university? Is it a religious-based university? Is it a public university? Is it a predominantly white, predominantly Hispanic? What part of the world is it? Are you teaching online, face-to-face? All of these things have impacts on the types of instructional strategies that you might use to facilitate learning. And then I think also that leans towards what I would love to see, or I think what the ultimate goal in some of the work that I do is going back to that capacity building. Folks could leave a workshop or a seminar that I had a hand in facilitating. It would be that they now know more about how to intentionally or more intentionally and with care and precision select the right types of learning interventions based on what the context is of the situation that they're trying to, of the learners in their programs or what have you, that then they're able to say, okay, here are the things that I'm trying to do. Here are my learning goals. Here are my hopes and dreams for these folks in this environment. Now I can select the learning activities and how I'm going to assess that learning and be able to do it with some intentionality as opposed to, hey, Scott, I like case studies. Dave, you like case studies. Let's do a case study. And what are we doing? Right.
Dave, you mentioned something before we started recording that I just want to, I think it's really interesting. This is going to feel like a left turn, no pun intended, but I'm watching F1. Have either of you seen F1?
Great film. Great film.
Right?
Yeah.
And of course, we have the scene, and of course, this would be the same thing in pilot training, where we're going to put someone in the simulator, and this person is going to practice and practice and practice. And we can put someone in a golf simulator, we can put someone in a flight simulator. And a challenge that I continue to see is that we don't have an ability to scale some of the practice that needs to happen, that skill building that I think a lot of technology is really going to unlock. I think in the future, when we can put someone in a holodeck and maybe they have on AR glasses, or maybe it's just I'm in a room like I'm in right now, and I can actually practice negotiation, practice leading a meeting, practice giving a presentation. I don't know. I really liked that chapter on AI because I think it's going to unlock a lot of opportunity for us. Dan, I know this is a passion of yours.
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Yeah, there's so much opportunity in those areas, and some of the folks that I've had opportunities to chat with on one of the other podcasts that I've been working on, the Leaders in the Loop podcast. I know you've had Gary Lloyd on your podcast, and I have as well. And Greg Allen also has a Leadership Labs project that he's been working on. I'm hoping to chat with him soon on that podcast. And it's being able to simulate these types of conversations, not just text-based, but voice-based. And then ideally, I think we're getting towards what you're thinking about of, are we able to do this with live avatars that simulate what real people look like, with nonverbals and reactions and changes in the tone of their voice and what have you. And then also being able to do that on some type of virtual reality or augmented reality space. And I think about the Google glasses and the Meta glasses, when being able to get some of that real-time feedback. That is where I've seen that, where I guess it could go, and where I have seen some pilot versions of some of this stuff is like during meetings, you're having a meeting and you get a little alert from your chatbot you can be a little more assertive here. Hey, can you stop touching your face, so much? Hey, look at the camera. And all these things over time can help to develop that capacity. And some of the feedback that you get when those types of interactions are recorded and summarized and analyzed is, hey, do you want to work on A, B, and C? Because you did a lot of that last time. Can we set up a customized program where you're going to role play and work on those particular skills? Wow. Now we're doing something where we don't need human capacity necessarily, or human capital I don't need to be like, hey, Dave, can you come in and do this with me? I was just chatting with someone who was working with medical school education. And he said, one of the things we spend so much money on is hiring actors to come in and pretend to be patients. What if we could do that with AI? That could simulate what it's like to actually have these physician-patient interactions and really move the needle, and without having to use so much of people's valuable time, because actors are expensive. They have unions after all.
And Dave, where I was going with this in when I first set it up is, I think one limitation is funding. One limitation. Obviously, there's billions of dollars invested in F1. There's billions of dollars invested in flight school and flight training. And I don't know that we have that in leader development. Billions of dollars are being spent, but how much is actually going into really, truly investing in the future of doing this work, like growing up a little bit? I feel like we are in the paper and pencil era still at times, when we need to grow up as a field if we really want to get serious about truly training in a well-rounded way. Not just, hey, I gave you the exam, you got an A, now you're a leader. No, truly preparing people to be successful, right?
Yeah. And we're talking about F1, right? Like one of the things that I think leadership educators and leader developer and trainers can take away is that when F1 puts millions of dollars into the simulation that the Brad Pitt character is practicing on, he knows every time he gets into the simulation, he drives straight for 300 meters, and then they have a hairpin left turn, which he needs to take at 142 kilometers an hour. And that's how he practices. And it's based on a stable track. There's no stable track in leader development because people are complex, people are different, contexts change. But that doesn't mean that we can't practice. And to Dan's point, too, I referenced Becky Reichard. She also, her work, she does behavioral assessment and putting people in simulations and these are mostly execs who are in MBA programs, for example, where this rising exec would literally be putting up a simulation with human actors where they're given a challenge and they're instructed to respond, and there's cameras on them, there's microphones, they're being recorded. And then later on, they get a pretty comprehensive assessment of their behaviors, positive and negative.
Yep.
And what she talks about in this, and I'm talking to her about this because I'm trying to figure out how to simulate some of this in higher ed with undergraduate students, not just MBA students that are paying thousands of dollars for the experience. Can we do this in a co-curricular situation? One of the things she talks about is how much effort, energy, and money this takes for her to bring one person through a simulation over the course of an hour, all the hours that have to go into that, all the dollars that have to go into that. And so some of the things we were talking about before we started recording is funding. How is the scholarship of leader development funded? And it's not funded even close to the level of which people talk about it. Everyone's talking about how important leader development is. I remember as a young faculty member going through some grants training here where I teach at the University of Illinois. And I remember being told very explicitly, very nicely, but very explicitly from funding agencies in the federal government, Dave, we know how important leader development is in the work of your scholarship is, but we're trying to teach fourth graders how to read. Because if they don't learn how to read, their trajectory is going to take a left turn for the rest of their lives. Or alternatively, we're trying to teach people how dangerous it is to use marijuana. You throw an example out, right? Because if they don't know that, they might be taking 20 years off of their living. We talk about how important leader development is, but we haven't really put our funding sources where our mouths are. And I'm not necessarily blaming the United States federal government, but overall, I think that's the case. That's not just the United States federal government. That's any agency that cares about leader development. We need to do a better, more comprehensive, more organized job of assessing its strengths and weaknesses. I remember listening to Barbara Kellerman a few years ago talking about the professionalization of the field. Yep. And I think that we need to do that. The organization required to do some of the scholarship that Dan and I are talking about requires a little bit more of a funding organization also, and being able to put our money where our mouths are.
Yeah. A lot of opportunity. I think we're talking, in some ways, we're talking about these instructional strategies as critical to the learning, but we're also in this conversation, we've talked a little bit about scaffolding. How do we scaffold that learning? I walk into some rooms and people are talking about complexity and it's a course of sophomores. No, and Dave, you and I have talked about, is even starting with theory the right place? Did we just start building some habits of mind and really ensuring that people can actively listen? Is that where we start some of this work? So there's still some questions in that space, so that scaffolding. And then we've got the challenge, a little bit of scale. How do we scale the learning for all these individuals? And we're not having to pay actors, but how do we individualize and scale individualized learning for each one of us? Because every one of us are going to have different rough edges and strengths and areas that maybe I'm more conflict avoidant, so I need to spend a little more time in that space to really build that skill. But there's a lot of opportunity there. And then I know that there's a lot of opportunity when it comes to evidence-based leader development. And Dave, let's close down with you. You happen to be an editor of a journal.
Yes.
And would you talk about some of the opportunity that's out there for any of our listeners as you think about this space? It's wide open, it feels.
So thanks, Scott, for me plugging my journal. It's the Journal of Leadership Education. It's published by Emerald Publishing House. Any Google search will bring you to that journal. And it's a journal that is very explicitly and specifically focused on the process of leader development. How do we educate people? How do we help people learn? How do we help people grow and develop into the types of leaders that we want them to be? One of the things that I think when most people who are not in academia, who aren't college university professors, as Dan and I are, right? Most people, when they think about academic journals, they think about boring, long, esoteric articles that who would want to read that other than as help to fall asleep? And I think that there are some grains of truth to that. At the same time, I think this journal, what I really love about Journal of Leadership Education, is that it focuses not just on empirical research. And we're talking about the importance of empirical research, but it also has a place for the people who talk about the stories of leader development. How do their students go through an experience? How does a training setting need to be set up to be successful from a participant perspective? And it places importance not just on tenure track faculty members whose job it is to take all of this money and do some of this scholarship. It also is a place for consultants. It's a place for administrators. It's a place for educators to read about and even conduct some of the scholarship to help advance our field too.
Love it. And Dan, I want you to have a little bit of time to plug your 2 podcasts because they're essential. So would you talk a little bit about that? And then we're going to wind down.
Sure, glad to. Yeah. I know you've welcomed Lauren and I on your podcast in the past. So our podcast, and Lauren is faculty at Temple University, associate professor of instructor there. And it's called the Leadership Educator Podcast. We've been doing that since very late in 2019. And it's a place to build the capacity of folks that are doing the same stuff we're talking about here, developing the capacity of leadership educators, folks that work in leadership development and training spaces. It tends to be a little bit higher ed centric, but we've also bring in folks from industry all the time. We're talking about teaching tools. We're talking about teaching strategies. We're talking about leadership programs. We're talking about folks that are experimenting with different types of things in their classrooms and their places and spaces where they're doing that type of work, as well as folks that are working in professional associations and communities of practice that are adjacent to our work, including things like management education as well. And then the other podcast is a newer project. We've just started getting going earlier. And I guess at about midway of 2025, Leaders in the Loop. And that is with my great colleague, Garv Khanna, who's an AI executive for Cisco Systems. And it's been just really fascinating to have conversations with him and with our guests because of the industry knowledge that he brings, and being a computer engineer with a great background and being able to talk to folks from IBM and Michigan Virtual and System Office, Chief Information Officers and things of that nature. So what we're looking at there is this intersection between leadership learning and AI. And I'd say the scope is, what about leadership learning and AI, where those things intersect, and what about those folks that are responsible for implementing and facilitating the adoption of AI in their systems and organizations and associations, and how are they managing that or leading that, if you will?
Oof, fun stuff. Okay, gentlemen, I'm closing out the podcast with a little bit of a different question nowadays. And that question is this: what's the practical wisdom that you would take away from our conversation today? So Dave, maybe we'll start with you. What's the practical wisdom here?
Yeah. So where my head goes is, I'm the tenure track faculty member who's the editor of a research journal. Where I'm thinking about is, if I'm a faculty member, if I'm someone who is engaged in the process of helping the world better understand the process of leader development, like the phrase that I sticking in my head, probably because I said it a couple of times, is unlocking the process. What does the process need to look like? How do we need to unlock it so that we can do it more? You talked about scope. You talked about scale. Dan was talking about context and contextual factors.
And evidence.
Yeah. We, as faculty members, we don't need to talk about the impact of leadership. We know that it's impactful. We need to understand how.
Love it. Dan?
Yeah, I would say I'll borrow from the definition of active learning, which is doing things and learning about the things that you're doing. Take the time to learn about the pedagogies that you're using in your programs. If you're someone who is facilitating leadership learning, you work in leadership education, development, or training, what are you doing? What do you know about the things that you're doing? Why are you selecting case studies, simulation, games, 360s, Myers-Briggs? Know why. Talk about intentionality, learn about the intentionality. Take that time to not only be playful with it, but to understand it in and out. And you'll have a lot more fun and you'll be a lot more effective.
Dave, I'm excited to have a conversation with you 5 years from now to see if you still have a fear.
Hopefully it will be, I have less fear.
That's going to be the last episode of this. Whenever that happens, I'll be in a hospital bed and I'll be like, Dave, you still have a fear.
Yes, now that we have answered every question.
Oh, gentlemen, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Always so much fun to be with you and just explore dialogue. And I think the world of the two of you. So until next time, be well.
Thanks for having us.
You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.